Welcome to the 38th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. These calls are held every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Scott Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, my guest is historian and psychotherapist Chuck Strozier. We are streaming on YouTube Live. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter. My handle on Twitter is @US of Disaster. You can also hear the COVID calls recorded as podcasts. Just go to the soundcloud.com site and connect to the COVID calls podcast. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for guests and future topics. And please feel free to suggest yourself to be a guest on a future COVID calls. On Thursday, I will talk to Daniel Zerilli. Mr. Zerilli is New York City's Chief Climate Policy Advisor and one NYC Director in the Office of the Mayor of New York. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and climate change. As of today, there are 3,721,779 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 3,640,835 cases yesterday. 1,214,572 of those are in the United States, up from 1,194,494 yesterday. There are now a total of 71,526 reported deaths in the United States from COVID-19, up from 70,272 deaths yesterday. As I did yesterday, I'm going to share an obituary with you now. This one appeared in, actually on WNYC Public Radio, May 1st. Guillermo Freston. Guillermo Freston lived in a different country the 8 years of his relationship with the love of his life, Ana Maria Castro Ortez. Freston resided in the Bronx and Castro Ortez in Jinotepe, a small city in southwest Nicaragua, where she was raising their 3 daughters. He was 51, she's 30. They had dreamed of reuniting the family in the Bronx, perhaps as early as this December. Freston, known as Willie, immigrated to the Bronx from Nicaragua in his 20s after fighting for the Sandinistas. He became a United States citizen and was a husky, kind-hearted union foreman with Local 731. He worked mostly construction and maintenance jobs on the city's bridges and had just passed his 25th work anniversary, the union said. There was another thing Freston always talked about, Nunez said, his friend, Castro Ortez and the girls. That's the love of his life, her and his daughters. That was Willie's life, he said. Nothing else mattered to him. Freston met Castro Ortez in 2012 on one of his visits back to his home country. She said they fell in love quickly. She even took his eldest daughter in with another woman as his own. She even took in his eldest daughter with another woman as her own. The couple had 2 more daughters together and were married in 2016. They were working on immigration paperwork to be able to move into Freston's apartment on Boston Road later this year, but those dreams were cut short. On March 28th, Freston died alone in his apartment about 4 weeks after the first coronavirus case was confirmed in New York City, 2 weeks after the first death, and about a week after Governor Cuomo put the state on pause. We practically lived on video calls, Castro Ortez recalled. When Freston got sick, they were video chatting too. On March 23rd, just as COVID-19 cases were starting to spike in the city, Freston showed up for work at the George Washington Bridge with a dry cough. His supervisor sent him home. So Castro Ortez tried to care for him by cell phone video from 3,000 miles away. Freston's fever was rising. She encouraged him to drink tea, bathe, take naps, and eat whatever he could, but he looked pale and was sweating, and he had uncontrollable coughing fits. One morning, while they were on a video call, she watched him get up to go to the bathroom, then collapse on the floor. Castro Ortez wanted to call some of his friends to go check on him, but he kept reassuring her he'd be fine. By then, it was Friday night, 3 days after Freston went home from work. They left the video call running that night. but at some point the call went out. As soon as Castro Ortiz woke up, she tried calling, but Freston didn't answer. She said she called every half hour throughout the morning. The New York State Funeral Directors Association confirmed that many countries won't accept human remains without a letter verifying that the person is not infectious, and those letters are hard to come by. Some airlines have stopped shipping human remains. Nearly a month later, Castro Ortiz was still waiting for her husband's ashes to arrive back home. That's the obituary of Guillermo Freston as published by WNYC on May 1st. I'm going to turn now to the discussion for today. My guest, I'm so glad to bring him to COVIDCalls, Charles B. Strozier. Chuck Strozier is Professor Emeritus of History at John Jay College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Also he's a training and supervising analyst at the TRISP Foundation and a practicing psychoanalyst. He has twice been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2001 and in 2011, and was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize in 2017. He is the author of scores of articles on history and psychoanalysis, and the author or editor of 13 books, including Heinz Kohut, The Making of a Psychoanalyst, Until the Fires Stopped Burning, 9/11, and New York City in the Words and Experiences of Survivors and Witnesses in 2011, and as the lead, with Terman, Jones, and Boyd, The Fundamentalist Mindset, Psychological Perspectives on Religion, Violence, and History. Chuck Strozier, thank you so much for making time to come on COVIDCalls.
Thank you for asking me, Scott.
I'd like to remind people that you can get questions in at any point in the conversation. You can put the questions up on Twitter, just tag me at US of Disaster, or you can email me directly, sgk23@drexel.edu, or you can put them in the YouTube live chat. We'll get to those questions. So as I always have been doing with these calls, Chuck, I just start by asking how you're doing, where you are, and how things are where you are. So tell us, where are you and how are you?
Well, actually, I'm fine now. I was in New York and increasingly worried about the early stages of the disaster. I mean, that was a very moving obituary you read. I began to feel I had a bout of cancer in the fall, and I was going through chemo in January and February. So I'm 70. Well, I was then 75. So I'm a male. I'm an old guy, and I had a compromised immune system. So I was very worried about the statistics that I was in the niche of people who actually die from this. Although the obituary you read indicates that by no means is only people over 70. But I was very worried, and I was actually watching with my wife, watching Rachel Maddow on Tuesday, March 10th. And she had a scoop, and the scoop was a health official in the Trump administration had recommended that seniors not fly. And I looked at my wife, I said, this is scary, we got to get out of here. So we hired a mover the next day. Friday, they came and loaded up 190 boxes of, after 34 years in New York, including 65 boxes of books and furniture. And Saturday, they loaded it up on trucks. And we slept on a mattress on Saturday night, and Sunday morning we drove to Florida and stayed with some friends for a while. And I bought a condo, and now we've just finished moving in. So there's no place totally secure, but it's much safer and secure than New York. I read the New York Times every day. It's heartbreaking what people are going through. Absolutely heartbreaking. And sometimes I feel guilt that I feel so secure down here in Florida on the ocean and having a good time. And I feel like I'm vicariously experiencing the pandemic.
Well, so many of the things you just said, we're going to talk about in more detail today, how people feel about it, the distance that they may be feeling, guilt, but also I'm just glad you're okay.
Thanks. I'm glad you're okay. Since you and I go way back, we're having taught together for many years and known each other for about 20, 25 years. You know,
We do, although I would say that nothing I have thought about or talked about or taught with you over the years has prepared me for what I've seen in the last 8 weeks. And in fact, I have worried that I've been in some denial at various moments, and that's what I wanted to ask you about first, because we see the word denial is used a lot. We've heard the word denial a lot in the past. Think about the Holocaust or thinking about climate change more recently. But even thinking about the President of the United States right now, a lot of discussion in the media about him denying the facts of COVID-19, or people who want to protest at Michigan State House or in Texas because they want to be released from social distancing orders. They're denying the seriousness of it. But I've wondered too, if we don't all have some bit of denial, or how do we cope with a reality this big and this terrifying? And what do you think about that?
Well, I think psychologically, denial is not always unhealthy. I think, and denial is a complex psychological phenomenon, because it involves separating yourself from the full knowledge of something because it is scary, traumatic, or whatever. But it can serve adaptive functions in terms of getting through something and not succumbing to complete paralysis with anxiety. So I think to keep in mind that denial is not altogether an unhealthy reaction, but basically it merges, as we've seen, it merges with a lot of corruption at the national level. The way in which Trump is trying to reopen the economy purely for political reasons, to keep the economy humming again so he'll get reelected, and to feeding the forces I mentioned, Lansing and Austin, Texas. I mean, feeding those kind of collective right-wing forces of denial. That's not healthy, and that represents a kind of a one kind of response, I think, to the extreme fear that we have of the virus. On the other hand, it's sort of the mirror image of it, or the other end of the spectrum, whatever would be the metaphor, is the kind of panic. I mean, many of my patients, and I've just my practice, which was robust in New York, is now still robust because I see everybody on Zoom basically. But all my patients are still in New York, and often people are just reduced to a sense of passive helplessness. Binge watching series that they've seen 3 times before, eating too much. Some people have trouble getting out of bed, and that's also, it's not helpful, and one can understand it and empathize with it. But I think it's also a kind of a reaction to the dangers and the fears that we face, that one would like to see mitigated somehow.
The merging of those two, to me, is really fascinating and important, and I think we haven't talked about it enough in the public. This sense that denying the fullness of the horror of these 70,000 plus people, and the data that came out yesterday that shows we may be having 3,000 deaths a day by June. That's one 9/11 a day in June. So you're talking about the potential self-preservation of some measure of denial or distance. But when Donald Trump denies the science or the reality or the gravity of that situation, say more about how you think he's working with that. Is it possible he also can't take in the fullness of it? Is he preserving himself, or do you think this is strategic on his part to mobilize that denial towards political ends?
I think it's dangerous to try to psychoanalyze a living, and dangerous and and ethically possibly.
I figured you would say that, but I thought I would ask.
But I think you can talk about what I call Trumpism. In other words,
Uh-huh.
there's a movement, there's a kind of a Trumpist movement in America that merges with right-wing populism, anti-intellectualism. What I, with the colleagues, you mentioned the book called The Fundamentalist Mindset, the sense of paranoia that is newly virulent. It's not, it's always been there in American history, comes and goes, but it's mostly has been marginal, which you as an historian know very well. But it's assumed new life, I think, ever since 9/11, and it's particularly been given energy and vibrancy by the Trump administration, and so the Trumpism, this really movement that's filled with hatred, filled with the anti-Chinese American new forms of racism, for example, because the virus comes out of China. I mean, that's so toxic and awful. But it merges sort of generally with sort of new paranoia. We began hating immigrants and Mexicans, and then it sort of became Muslims, and now we forgot about the Mexicans and the Muslims, and it's being directed to the Chinese, the sort of finding the enemy, finding somebody else who's responsible for this awful pandemic, which is profoundly confusing.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth remembering, we don't understand where it came from. We don't understand its biology. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know what the waves of it will be. We know we suspect it'll always come in waves, as all pandemics do, partly because people, I think, psychologically, they can't stand being cooped up. So then they get out and then you have a new wave. But there's so little that we really know about this virus. And we don't have even medicines to cure you of it if you get it. And we certainly don't have a vaccine. And when will we have a vaccine? And all these kinds of issues is part of the pervasive anxiety that surrounds any kind of attitude, so that we're surrounded by death. And particularly in a place like New York, that's kind of what I called in my work on 9/11, the zones of sadness. I mean, we have a new geography of death in New York, only it's not Lower Manhattan, it's Elmhurst, Queens, and parts of the Bronx and parts of Brooklyn and parts of Williamsburg when the Orthodox Jews have a funeral for their Rebbe. I mean, these kinds of settings create a pervasive sense of horror that we live with, that is intensified because we're so confused about what it means and where it comes from, and most of all, when it'll end. Mm-hmm. When is it ever going to end?
So that then, what we're talking about has a lot to do with trust, and somebody who can make sense of uncertainty. I mean, even thinking about climate change, the climate change science, which we speak of, those of us who keep up with it, we can speak with some certainties now. But for a long time, there's been, among scientists, there's disagreement, not now so much, but there has been, about what were the most important findings, what were the most important metrics and data points. Those of us who put trust in science have been convinced for a long time, because we trust that scientists more or less are trying to, get towards some truths, and they're not trying to trick us into buying energy efficient cars because we all want to become social. We just don't buy into those rhetorics of trust. But do you see something exposed right now in this pandemic about sort of some shift in the American mind and who Americans trust? You said this Trumpism is coalescing of forces that have been out there for a while. Is that resurgent in some way? Is that emergent in some way? Are you more nervous about that now, or this just happens to be a particularly bad situation and you saw this coming?
2 points. What you said about climate change, there is a very interesting sense in which the virus becomes a part of our experience of climate change, and that both come from nature. both come from, the virus comes from jumping from animals to humans. And the climate change, because of our interactions with the environment, the nature is punishing us and creating a more and more increasingly dangerous world for where the causation of those changes, but it impacts us in often a quite deadly way. So it's an interesting kind of parallel, which makes it makes us feel nature becomes very dangerous. The natural world is dangerous. And the other thing that's happening as a consequence of the pandemic and with social distancing is we become enemies of each other. The way we solve it, you have to stand at least 6 feet away from people, and if they get closer, you really recoil. You can see people recoiling on the street, so that we experience our neighbors as our enemies, and that is going to have long-lasting. The second part of your question, that I think is going to have long-lasting consequences. I mean, the economics of this are going to take years to get over, but also just the sort of group self, the sense of collective identity of who our neighbors are and who we can trust and who we can love and how we can get along with people. What kind of communal identities can we foster and continue? I think the sense of people dying alone. I mean, the obituary you read of the man all by himself talking to his wife in Nicaragua, and he collapses on the screen on the Zoom. He collapses on the floor, and I mean, I know a colleague who's dying in the hospital, and his wife can't go see him. I mean, that's the experience of people, and not just occasional people, but thousands of people dying alone. And I think that's something that it'll take a long time to mourn and to work through and to, reconcile ourselves to. How could we let that happen? How can that be,
I have, it's been complicated for me. I've had so many mixed thoughts about this. On the one hand, I'm deeply impressed with the sort of global collective action that we see. And even people who are thinking about climate change and have become very pessimistic in the last few years that anything was possible. And now within 12 weeks, people around the world listen to scientific experts who tell them a course of action, and they do it. And it vastly disrupts their lives in all the many ways that we've talked about. And they chafe against it, they don't like it, and they still do it to protect themselves and their family, but also to protect people they will never meet. That's impressive to me. But on the other side is what you're describing, the enforcement of distance, the Zoom Shiva, the seeing your loved one. I mean, that's an extraordinary case of the obituary, but seeing a loved one collapse on a screen, not being able to reach out. I don't know how to reconcile those two sides of the psychological ledger in terms of how they will impact people. I mean, you're an expert in the American Civil War, in the history of terrorism. I mean, you really understand in a deep way the ways that trauma and distance can affect people psychologically. Do we have good models to think with here, or good historical examples to help us make sense of this kind of a moment?
Well, I would never want to lose the hope. I find it very annoying when people talk about climate change and say it's the end of civilization as we know it, and there's no hope, and we passed the tipping point, and all is lost. I just refuse to believe that. And I think more immediately during the pandemic, a lot of people, including some of my patients, are absolutely loving being sheltering in place. They're getting along, doing more things with their children, and they're getting along. One woman gets along with her husband now, and they've never had a better relationship. And they paint with their children. So it's not, the human spirit is very resilient, and I think one wants to hold on to that. On the other hand, I mean, your larger question is one that I've thought a lot about and been troubled by, and that's in the nuclear age. I do think that we always are subject to the threat of radiation and death and totalistic death from nuclear weapons that hangs over us. It's a shadow. And I think in this case, in the case of the virus, there's a specific connection between the virus and radiation, in that the virus is tasteless, it's an invisible contamination. We can't see it, we can't feel it, we can't smell it, we can't hear it. And yet it penetrates our body just like radiation, and it carries death. So I think one of the things that is happening psychologically, is that the virus is intensified and amplified because of that largely unconscious association with nuclear threat. And that's something. Nuclear threat is, the world changed on August 6, 1945. And we changed psychologically. Our relationship to death changed. And so when you have something like the pandemic, which is unlike 9/11, not just an event that happened one day with massive consequences, but then we moved away from it. This, as you say, we're at a point now where we have the deaths occurring every day, the equivalent to 9/11. And of course, that's deaths. That's not the number of infections. I mean, the number of infections are 8 or 10 times that, at least. So yes, there's something new about the intensification of our psychological despair with the pandemic. As with 9/11 and other kinds of disasters, but particularly with 9/11 and the American experience, it evokes it evokes the fears of radiation and nuclear fear. In other words, evokes the apocalyptic. Right. Evokes the apocalyptic narrative, and that lends it that lends the kind of fear and anxieties we have a particular character, leading to truly bizarre conspiratorial explanations. I mean, there are always going to be conspiracies, and as you know, we taught together courses on 9/11. I mean, the 9/11 conspiracy was a very robust thing in America for 5 or 6 years. But this is like one conspiracy theory after another, from 5G towers to, labs in China to, I mean, it's like bloated dystopians like Rush Limbaugh. They seem to come up with another conspiracy every day for the possibilities.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and my guest today is historian and psychotherapist Chuck Strozier. Chuck, I want to draw you out on this, on the apocalyptic and the connection. I haven't heard anybody make this connection as clearly as you just have. I think we should linger with it a little bit longer. You said that the world changed August 6, 1945. And from there on, this sort of specter of the apocalyptic hangs over people. And you make this connection also to radiation. It can't be seen, it can't be sensed. It seems to be so mysterious, it can work on you. And I think the way we've seen the COVID-19 written about, and that so many people may be carrying it or have had it and not know, similar to the way we conceptualize people who've been exposed to radiation, if they're downwinders in Nevada, or if they're people who are living in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I guess one of the ways into this is to ask you to say a little bit more about apocalyptic thinking more generally. What does it spring from? How does it operate? And how, just as you were talking about denial, is there an upside of that? Is there some sort of human self-preservation aspect involved in the apocalyptic, or is this something we just really need to be called out and be afraid of?
Well, historically, the apocalyptic, which is humans are the only animals with foreknowledge of our death. And the apocalyptic is the extension of that to all humans. So the apocalyptic is a totalistic death. Until the nuclear age, the apocalyptic was always very important. It was very important to create an apocalyptic narrative. And it really may have, I think, we don't have written records, so we can't know for sure. I think it was important in mystical religious thinkers in the creation of culture. I don't know that, but that's what I suspect, just psychohistorically. But the thing about the historically is the stories that we have, the apocalyptic stories we have, the Ur text is the book of Revelation, it always requires God, two things. It always requires God to carry out the destruction. And there's a point. The point is Jesus comes back, the Messiah comes, the remnant survives, the reborn, and everybody else dies. So it's total destruction, but it's hopeful. It's hopeful, and endings are beginnings. And that's true of absolutely every apocalyptic story in every religion and every secular, like the Nazis. The Nazis survive and everyone else dies, right? In the thousand year Reich. With nuclear weapons, what's so fundamental is it's what you have Robert J. Lifton's Death and Life on your shelf up there. It's what Robert J. Lifton called in another book, not in that book, called "It's a Pointless Apocalypse." We don't get the Messiah after nuclear destruction or ending the world through destroying the environment and climate change, which he's recently called a kind of a twin apocalyptic. But it's a pointless apocalypse. It's nothing but death. It's horrible. And that's the shadow. That's the shadow, the utter meaninglessness of ultimate destruction and death. And there is no hope. There is no story. It is without any kind of meaning. That changes our relationship to death. And when you change your relationship to death, you change us as human beings. You know, that's why he calls the book Death and Life. In other words, life has meaning because we imagine ourselves symbolically to continue through our children, through our work, through our communal activities, through exalted states, drug states. But we always imagine that we will continue in some symbolic way. Right? And those kind of feelings exist as a shadow in everybody's thinking. And, you know, to say, well, I don't think about nuclear threat. Have you seen a movie coming out of Hollywood? Have you watched a TV series? Mm-hmm. You don't, everybody knows this. Everybody thinks it's there in the unconscious. I mean, I've been amazed, actually, that I have not seen a single commentator make the connection between the coronavirus and the radiation. Mm-hmm. It's astonishing.
Yeah. Well, so many things to think with in what you're talking about here. You mentioned Lifton, and one of the concepts that was important to me with Lifton is his notion of psychic numbing, which I think is relevant here, perhaps, that the burden of this knowledge of the pointless apocalypse is so great that's too great to carry around. It seems like. I mean, is that maybe that ties back to the discussion we were having earlier about denial, and that the knowledge that this pandemic has gotten loose, and this is a multi-year event, and it can't be drawn to an end until there's a vaccine, maybe if then, is that the relationship that you're thinking with here, that sort of escaped the bounds of human control? It will be with us and amongst us for, I've heard some scientists say, we're living with this now. This coronavirus is just part of humanity. We'll live with it. Maybe we'll learn how to cope with it. Maybe we won't. I mean, is that the connection you see to the nuclear?
Yeah, I mean, I've stressed the similarities. There are differences, and I think psychic numbing. The thing about nuclear threat, and the reason is that I think people haven't made the connection between the virus and nuclear and radiation, and is that it's so difficult to stay with. It's so difficult to think about that we almost have to fall back on a kind of psychic numbing, which is really not helpful, because then it's hard to develop a nuclear politics that creatively adapts the world to the threats that we pose, that are posed from nuclear weapons and from climate change. I do think it's important to remember that the coronavirus is not apocalyptic. However many people die from it, it will not end the human project.
Right.
And those who die individually and collectively, it's tragic, and it's just like a big war or a genocide or a plague. Well, plagues in the old days, but it's not apocalyptic. But it evokes apocalyptic fears, and because of the similarities with radiation, it evokes something that is largely unconscious, that amplifies our experience of the virus, which makes it very difficult to deal rationally with the scientific explanations, and people are confused, and who knows where it's going. But the hope is we're not all going to die. I may die, you may die, whatever, our neighbors may die, and but the human project will continue, unlike a wholesale exchange of nuclear weapons, between Russia and the United States, or between Pakistan and India now, or whatever.
That's there's another connection here that you've got me thinking of, which has been on my mind a lot, and that is, in the Cold War, the mutually assured destruction theories, and I think Stanley Kubrick did such a beautiful job in Dr. Strangelove in sort of showing us the logic of nuclearism, which is not a logic at all. It's a death cult. It's and the realization in those times that there were people, not just average people, but people running the United States, who got up in the morning and they accepted that on the behalf of everyone else. They accepted that this might happen today. This could go down today. And I've wondered, that's the people who were paying attention, who were against nuclear weapons at that time. I mean, they articulated that clearly. This is too much power for any one person or small cadre of people to have. It corrodes democracy. It gets rid of transparency. It erodes our free press. And I've been thinking about that in the context of this pandemic, that we have a small group of people who are making outsized decisions. Seemingly, it's hard to keep giving them the benefit of the doubt here. So, I guess my question to you is that another dimension of this when we think about the connection to the nuclear, the apocalyptic? How do you see it mapping onto the way we relate to our government?
It's a very interesting question. Certainly with the nuclear priesthood, as it's been called, of people who, from the 1950s, when it began to emerge, a small cadre of experts who claimed that it was much too complicated for ordinary people to understand, and therefore the crucial decisions about building and using and the policies around nuclear weapons needed to be made by the physicists who really understood. Right? As Robert Oppenheimer, the leader of the Manhattan Project, pointed out, physicists have known sin. Needless to say, he was not popular among his colleagues for such a view.
Mostly banished, actually.
Banished, as a matter of fact, right? But of course, that's it. I've always found that idea literally repulsive. Ordinary people who know nothing about the physics can understand the idea of everyone dying. And so the human meanings of total destruction are ones that that ordinary people should develop a nuclear politics. There is a kind of a priesthood around the virus. It's not exactly the same, because they're also confused. What I'm more impressed with is the corrupt way that Trump himself lies, manipulates, delays, will do anything to manipulate and control the policies toward the virus in order to get elected. And then because he's been so effective creating this movement, this Trumpism, as I call it, they are sort of lemmings to the scene, and they're the right wing calls them out to go to Lansing, and they go to Lansing without masks and hug each other and stay together and wave Confederate flags, and probably half of them will be dead in 6 months. And they're being totally manipulated to, around the issues of supposed individual freedom and calling for. Trump's called to liberate, the democratic states. What language? What repulsive language! Completely contradicting his own health officials.
Right. I've seen some hopeful things there in states that have so-called restarted, that people are not just running back out. And it may be that, and I hadn't thought about this until this discussion today, but that there may be also this connection back to the Cold War in some ways, that there was a breach of trust with public officials in the Vietnam era and the Cold War, that we do see resurface in various times since that. And maybe this is one of those. People in Georgia, just because you can go get a haircut or go to the beach, that doesn't mean everyone is flocking there. And public opinion polls show that even Republicans still believe that the social distancing measures are worth doing. They have some health benefit.
Like over 80%.
Yeah.
Over 90% of Democrats believe it, but it's still the vast majority of Republicans. They know what it means to die.
Right.
And they know that all legitimate health officials are cautioning and encouraging the continuation of social distancing and using masks. So it's, people aren't stupid.
Yeah. So the priesthood has
a lot of people on the right wing would like to believe that ordinary people are stupid and can be controlled and manipulated, but they're not. They need to be trusted and empowered and encouraged to participate in a common effort to mitigate we can't, at this point, we can't eliminate, but we can certainly mitigate the effects of the widespread death.
I want to remind people you're listening to COVID Calls. My guest today, Chuck Strozier. And Chuck, you mentioned a little while earlier some of the connection you saw. You talked about the zones of sadness. You wrote this tremendous book after the fire stopped burning about 9/11. And let's open a conversation about that, because I also think there were some, as the death, this is hard to remember almost, as the death toll from COVID-19 was approaching Katrina level, there was some stories about that. And as it approached 9/11 level, there were some stories about that. And then it raced past it so fast that I think we haven't gone back to those discussions and gotten everything we could out of them. You were treating patients after 9/11. You were teaching students after 9/11 at a college that lost many students who were firefighters and in the police force. You lived that experience as a person in New York as well. Let's talk a little bit about these connections you see, maybe how America changed after 9/11 that's affecting the way we look at the pandemic, or just resonances you see in this moment.
I think there are a lot of resonances. One thing that we all, you and I, the scientists, the health officials, the doctors, the nurses, we are all, it's a shared trauma. And that's certainly something that I experienced in my work, my research on 9/11. I was going through, my family was affected, my wife was affected, she got caught in the plume, she had lung disease, and I was talking to people who were deeply traumatized. So I think that sense of shared trauma is something that's a real area of commonality between what we're going through with the pandemic. And I mean, you're doing these COVID calls and creating a wonderful archive for people to understand it both now and in the future. But you're also living in Princeton, and you've got children, and you must have your own worries, and as I had my own anxieties, which is why I left New York in mid-March, and it's better here, but it's certainly there. And I talk to my patients who are, even more anxious. I try to help them, but I can't deny the fact that, it affects me as well. But I do think that the sense of being in the midst of, particularly in New York, although it's also across the globe and everywhere in the country, that sense that we are in the middle of a disaster, where it's an ongoing, unfolding disaster. And that was certainly true of 9/11. I mean, you and I taught a course on it 3 times. And one of the key things that we emphasized in understanding 9/11, it all occurred, it was not a day.
Right.
The day began a process. I wrote my book emphasizing the first 100 days when the fire still burned on the pile. But even that is misleading, because we started one war and cleaned up the area, and then started another war, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And over the course of the next decade, millions were made refugees. And so, it's all part of an ongoing process. And I think that's something we certainly are seeing now and feeling with the pandemic.
One of the connections that strikes me has to do with actually with the dead, and I was struck. You remember that photograph? It was a pretty famous photograph in the time. It was of St. Vincent Hospital, of all the doctors and nurses outside the hospital on September 11 with the empty stretchers.
I have that picture in my book. Right, yeah. They were waiting for the bodies, and the bodies never came.
Yeah, they're waiting.
Right.
And of course, hospitals in New York had the opposite issue in the month of April. But at the same time, so much of that was still those emergency rooms are not open for any news camera to walk in and take pictures of. Those ICU beds, even families can't get in. So there's such a distance and a remove from the body, unlike other disasters in which so much of it happens open and in public. I don't know if you've been struck by that connection and what the larger impact of that may be when disasters occur and we don't have that closure. In 9/11, it was literally the disintegration of bodies. In this case, it's death and bodies being removed, and we don't have a chance to grieve appropriately. I don't know how to make sense of that and how that may affect us.
The thing about 9/11 was that so many people died because they were incinerated, because they were burned, and that put them into the air, and New Yorkers breathed that air. So we literally took the dead into our lungs, into our hearts, into our bodies. And the parallel I made in my book on 9/11 is with the Holocaust, where, by the summer of 1944 in Auschwitz, 100,000 people a month were being burned. And it's, on a scale far outstripping 9/11, but it also now with the pandemic has a parallel. It's not the same, but a certain parallel in the mass death, and people, you can't see your loved one, and they truck, and they had just been piling the bodies up in the truck. I mean, just grotesque kind of stories of desecration of the dead, of the dead. And it's so important for humans to have rituals around death, to do certain things with the body, to honor it, to have memorials, and to see the body. There's something about being with the body at death, but also to see that body, to connect with it. People have feelings about the soul, but the body, man, you know, whatever you believe about what leaves the body, death leaves the body. And that body has to be handled and respected and dealt with in a way that has integrity for people and for families and even for communities. And I think that's being profoundly interrupted in the pandemic.
That issue is one that is still a matter of contention around 9/11.
Yeah.
And the fact that the unidentified fragments, which have been retained by the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, are there at the site, underground, in the museum, behind the wall. And there are many families who are still deeply outraged about that, about what they see as a desecration of the body, and still this problem of so many who are never identified. And I wonder again if we can draw some parallels between that moment and our time. I mean, I think the grieving of 9/11 is incomplete. How could it be over by now? It's got to be a long-term process, but somehow also still the inability to identify some of those bodies and those really terrible fights about how to remember 9/11. I feel like we're going to be in some very similar kind of territory with this pandemic, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the word is synergy. You know, the inability, our inability to mourn 9/11 and to mourn and to take responsibility for the kind of the hundreds of thousands of deaths that were the result of the what Obama called the dumb war that we fought, and the millions of refugees. The sort of failure to own that then makes it brings it back with a vengeance and a confused vengeance to the kind of despair that we see with the pandemic, and more bodies and more meaningless death and more confused death. And these things build on one another. You know, it's not as though we have one disaster and then we have certain consequences and then it's over and then we forget it and then we move on and then we have another disaster. You know, they're not episodic like that. They reverberate and connect and reinforce and amplify each other.
I've been thinking about that a lot, that point that you just made, that 9/11, after 9/11, so much of our national discourse went back to talking about the Vietnam era. And that election of 2004 actually hinged on, you know, what had people been doing in Vietnam? Whereas the 2000 election was less, but somehow 9/11 jarred loose some resonance to Vietnam. And you know, you look at people now who are experiencing this disaster who might have been young when 9/11 happened. They've lived through 9/11, if they're in the United States, September 11, Katrina, the 2008 crash, Hurricane Sandy, and now this. I mean, what a disastrous era. And this, as you say, this sort of cumulative effect of people over time. I mean, at some point, I want to try to remain hopeful here. Does that somehow build resilience in individuals, or does it, maybe we can't generalize, but I want to think with this a little bit, because we have truly lived in disastrous times. We have not had a world war that's affected the United States. So you talk about the aftermath of 9/11 in Iraq. I mean, other parts of the world have borne the brunt of what's happened here in America, but Americans have not lived through war, but we have certainly lived in a disastrous age.
Yeah, no, absolutely, a disastrous age, and we're dealing with death in new ways. We are resilient. I think humans are resilient. And 9/11, for example, created all this havoc. We had dumb wars. We had all the kind of chaos and that we inflicted and created on the Middle East. On the other hand, and that grew from a kind of a panicked response to a brief period of communal rebirth in New York and the country, and then very quickly a kind of a paranoid, aggressive, searching for vengeance and wipe out the enemy and kill all Muslims and destroy the Middle East, and leading to sort of very violent wars. But in time, we developed, and I think, if you figure for 10 years after 9/11, that's the basic story. But the last 10 years, counterterrorism has matured. And I think people have a different attitude toward terrorism. They recognize that to overreact to terrorism is to play into terrorist hands. And people are much more likely, sort of counterterrorism has stabilized at all levels. There's much better coordination of counterterrorism efforts at the national and state and local levels and globally, and cooperation between various agencies. And so I think that's an area of vast overreaction that led in time to a more resilient expression of the human spirit. And I think with the pandemic, with COVID, in time, I mean, it's not going to happen right away. People who think it's going to be over in July or June are going to be seriously disappointed. And it'll probably be worse, as a lot of officials say, worse next winter than it has been this winter. But it will end. I mean, I don't believe that we are capable of finding an answer to this virus. I don't know what it is. Yeah. But I remain hopeful that we will find it eventually, and we will find ways to survive, and it will have consequences. And it'll take a long time to recover fully. But I think we are resilient enough as humans to survive and heal and create new forms, new collective political, but also medical structures and forms to deal with this particular virus, and hopefully learn from it so that we can survive other viruses, because this won't be the first one.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking with Chuck Strozier. We have a few minutes left. I want to get a couple of other things in. I just wanted to return back to something before we lose it entirely, about your discussion about 9/11 and smoke and breathing, because that's another connection. I've been thinking a lot about lungs and this sort of shared, of course, the air and the pollutants in the air, and the virus and the transmission of the virus. It's I think of these ways we often divide disasters up into these various, it's a fire, or it's an earthquake, or it's this, or it's that. It's something very powerful about the way you talked about the collective experience of 9/11. And not everyone breathed that air, just like not everyone is going to breathe in. We know they won't all breathe in this virus, but there still is this sense of connecting and wanting to connect to it. And you talk about the zones of sadness in your book about 9/11. And I've been thinking about that a lot. So some people will actually have that direct physical connection. They'll find out they either had it, or they were exposed, they recovered, they didn't know they were carrying it, just like 9/11. Some people really, truly experienced it on the site, but many, many millions, billions of other people experienced it too, in meaningful ways, in ways that really changed their lives. And so I guess the question I'm coming to is about survivors. And are we all survivors of this? How do we turn this moment, those who survive, how do we turn that to some advantage? How do we take this moment and turn it into a moment of collectivity and empathy and sharing, rather than saying, you know, there's people who had it and people who didn't. And I already see that bifurcation, and I want to reject that and move more to this sense of communality and community and survivorship.
Right. The one, we don't know fully who the survivors of the coronavirus are. And if 25% of the people are infected and have no idea that they're infected, but are carriers, it complicates that sense of who survives and who isn't. And in one sense, we're all, I think in a larger sense, unlike 9/11. 9/11, you either died, for the most part. There were people who were injured, but for the most part, you either died or you lived, and you were a survivor. Now, many people, as we discovered over the course of the next decade, and even into the second decade, people had their lungs affected, particularly those who worked on the pile, the firemen who worked on the pile, and people had been dying prematurely from cancers for a long time, which is actually not unlike the virus, and the lungs and the infected, and you're usually lung disease and lung cancer and that kind of thing that people have suffered from. But the survivors, we also don't, with the pandemic, because we don't have a good test and we don't have an antibody test, we don't know what number of people have had it and don't know it. There could be millions, probably are millions and millions of people. But there is a, more politically and psychologically, we live as survivors, even if we don't have it. I feel just, having fled New York and having faced the real dangers and continue to be in the cohort of people who are most threatened from getting it, and I'm very exceedingly cautious. I feel I sort of live as a survivor, and I think everyone has that sense of, we may not have it directly, but increasingly we all know people who have it, and we read the stories like the obituary, the moving obituary, and it's part of our collective experience of the pandemic, which has a hopeful side, because I think it expands our empathy.
I want to get to one more question, Chuck, and I didn't, I had forgotten to tell you that I was going to ask you about this, but I think you won't mind, because you're a scholar of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln has been talked a lot about in this last 2 months. So in a couple of different ways, and I didn't know if it had shown up on your radar, but I know you're always up for a good chat about Abraham Lincoln, having written this great book, Your Friend A. Lincoln, tremendous book. And two ways. One, the obvious one, presidential leadership. Okay, we don't have to beat a dead horse here. Donald Trump doesn't seem to have measured up to the test of Abraham Lincoln. But I think it's interesting that Lincoln is invoked always in these moments of national trial, not just about how you manage the government, but how you actually lead, how you exercise moral authority in a crisis. So that's been discussed. But then also that Lincoln's ability to be human, that is, to mourn, to experience his own demons, his own depression, and that he was a full human being. And it was obvious to those who knew him at that time that he was truly grieving and affected by the Civil War. And I don't know if you've, I know Lincoln's always sort of on your mind, what you've thought about Abraham Lincoln in these times, anything we can draw from his leadership, or just how he experienced the Civil War as a human being that could be helpful to us right now.
Right, and I think that's a very interesting point you made, or several points. And he was a truly admirable human being, and there aren't a lot of presidents one can say that about, and
too few,
and particularly the one we're living with. But he was a truly admirable, interesting, kind, empathic human being. He was also shrewd and smart and a statesman and a good politician and all those things. But he led the country through a civil war. He led the country through a war in which, latest count, 720,000 people died. At least 1.5 million were seriously maimed. For the next few decades, America was populated by people with one arm and one leg and serious wounds to their other parts of their body. And so he was able to create a kind of a collective sense of mourning for that. And without denying it, we needed to live with it. We needed to feel it. We needed to have compassion for the survivors, for the widows, for their children as the war ended. And he gave meaning for why the war occurred. And particularly in the second inaugural, which is right at the end of his life, a month before he died. That explained the point of the war in ultimately as God's punishment for the sin of slavery. And that made sense of the dying. I mean, the difference, of course, is that even if our current political leadership had the compassion and the humanity of Lincoln, there's no way that you could find that kind of reason for the pandemic. It remains deeply confusing. You can't give it, you can't explain it in the same way that Lincoln, as a remarkable president and human being, could explain the war for Americans.
But I can't help but think, as the election time draws near into the fall, that's what the two candidates will be forced to do, is to explain to Americans why we've gone through this. Mm-hmm. They'll have to, right?
Well, they'll try.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure what the answer is.
There's no, there's no Lincoln on the stump. Somehow I think he could explain this.
No Lincoln on the stump. Given Trumpism and given the toxic nature of the movement, the right-wing, paranoid, mean, ugly movement, I fear that there'll be some very
So I want to thank you for the time that you've given us this afternoon, Chuck, for this conversation. And with a few guests, I've been hoping to get them back at a later point also, because things are going to happen. A lot of things are going to happen in the months to come. So I hope we can get you back maybe a little bit later on in the summer. I want to remind people you've been listening to COVID Calls, and tomorrow I have Daniel Zerilli from the New York City Mayor's office to talk about climate change and COVID-19. I think we're looking forward to a great conversation. And we're on every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern time with COVID Calls. Chuck Strozier, great to see you. Great to speak with you and to learn from you as always.
It's an admirable project. It was good to talk to you.
Stay healthy, everyone. See you tomorrow, 5 o'clock.
Good.